Welcome everyone. This session will be about hybrid SharePoint deployments. Now, the focus of hybrid SharePoint deployments on this session will be on the search engine, which has some nice, interesting new capabilities. So a little bit about myself. I'm Thomas Vochten. I'm a Office Server and Services MVP. It's still a bit strange to me because I was a SharePoint MVP, but everything changed, right? I'm an infrastructure guy, so I fiddle around with performance tuning, capacity planning, architecture, all things around SharePoint. I always joke to my customers that I barely know what a SharePoint list is, but of course that just means that I'm mainly under the covers of the platform working on the infrastructure. I'm a fairly active Twitterer, so if you want to reach me afterwards with questions, you can feel free to contact me. My Twitter handle is @ThomasVochten. I've got a blog, but I must warn you, it's not really let's say a really interesting technical blog. It's more of an announcements platform because of all my public speaking engagements. And if you want to send me an email, that's fine too, that works. My email address is on the slides. I'm working for Xylos, which is a consultancy company based in Antwerp. I'm also a BBUcht, so the SharePoint user group board member, and as I already said, I'm a Microsoft MVP. The things that I do is SharePoint, Office 365, Azure, and a little bit of SQL Server on the side. So, what are we going to talk about today? First of all, I'll introduce you to hybrid SharePoint and what that means for an IT professional nowadays, how that works, how SharePoint on premises is relevant, how SharePoint online is relevant. That's what we are going to talk about. Then, before I show you all these interesting hybrid functionalities, it's important to talk about prerequisites. What do you need to run this functionality, and from a SharePoint side and from an Office 365 side? Then we'll talk about hybrid search, and that will be the bulk of the session. I'll show you the different examples, the different configurations that are possible. And last but not least, we're going to talk about hybrid OneDrive and team sites, because everyone is still talking about hybrid search, but OneDrive and team sites, there are also some very interesting hybrid capabilities to be found there too. So, an introduction to hybrid SharePoint. What does that mean? And if we look at the SharePoint world right now, and if we look at SharePoint online, well, the cloud is a great opportunity. At least I think so. For many people, it's a great opportunity. But the problem is that some people not view the cloud like this, but they view the cloud like this, a bit like a threat. In my personal opinion, you should not be worried if you're an IT pro. There will still be plenty of things to do, and even if you're running SharePoint, you don't have to be afraid that SharePoint will go away in a few months or a few years. I think Jeff Teeper recently announced from Microsoft that there will be even another version after this SharePoint 2016 version, probably. So you don't have to worry. SharePoint on premises is still okay. But if we look at the SharePoint story, if we look at the SharePoint features over the years, in this graph, when you consider the green line, that is the SharePoint product version. So we had a new product in SharePoint 2003, a product in SharePoint 2007, and you see the green line going up and up and up every time. So that means that innovation in the product is rising. The yellow line, on the other hand, was the customer innovation. That means when were people starting to adopt these new technologies? And when you look at the green line, you see a spike in SharePoint 2007. Then that's when SharePoint 2007 was introduced. And a few years later, in SharePoint 2009, the customer innovation, followed the same path. So people were always a little bit behind on the SharePoint features that were implemented. If you then look at the blue line, which is SharePoint Online, first of all, when it started out, it was easy for us consultants to tell our customers, well, SharePoint Online, it's nice, it has some interesting things, but it's still very, very, very limited. And we all know that in SharePoint 2013 and in the year 2013, that changed dramatically when SharePoint Online was upgraded to SharePoint 2013 and all these interesting features were introduced. And that's where we see, first of all, in SharePoint 2013, a little bit lacking in features, but after a few months, we saw that SharePoint Online had much more features to offer than the on-premises product. And well, it's very important to realize this blue line, and that will never change again. Because if you're looking at innovation in SharePoint, innovation will also be cloud first. Microsoft will introduce new features in SharePoint Online first, and then eventually some of those features might trickle down to SharePoint on premises. That does not mean that SharePoint on premises is bad. well, yet last week the new SharePoint 2016 version was released, so you're still good doing SharePoint on premises. But if you want to take advantage of the latest and the greatest, the nice features of SharePoint Online, things like Delve, for example, you really have to think about a new solution and a new way of combining your existing investments with the cloud. And that is where Hybrid comes in. If we look at SharePoint Hybrid, why would you do SharePoint Hybrid? First of all, because SharePoint, let's face it, it's hard. Some of my customers, or a customer recently told me that you need a degree in SharePointology to make things work. If we look at extranets, for example, everyone wants to have an extranet. And you can have an extranet on premises. You can build another farm. You can fiddle around with DMZs and firewalls and all kinds of very complicated stuff. And it works, but it's hard, and it's also expensive. If you look at the recent cloud offerings like OneDrive or Delve, you look at very interesting feature sets, especially Delve. I'm a big fan of Delve. You want to take advantage of them, and that's not possible if you're only using SharePoint on premises. Another thing that for many people is very important is they invested a lot of money in their existing SharePoint environment. Things like customization, things like farm solutions in SharePoint 2013 or 2010. You might have a consulting company develop a very, very specific application for you that is not compatible with the cloud because you're using farm solutions. Well, it's not because you're using that you can't go to the cloud or you can't take advantage of all these additional features. Something else is that it might be, well, good to prepare the culture of your company, prepare the minds of your people for the cloud, and generally introduce or gently introduce some new features from the cloud while still using the SharePoint on-premises infrastructure. But there you need a real culture shift, and Hybrid can help you in that. If we look at the hybrid capabilities of the product, we're always focusing on hybrid search. We're focusing on hybrid OneDrive and team sites later on. But traditionally, these three things were possible if we're talking about SharePoint Hybrid, especially with SharePoint 2013. So it's first of all hybrid search, business connectivity services. That's also possible. So you can have your own on-premises data sources connected to SharePoint Online and surface that data in SharePoint Online. That is possible. And you've got Duet Enterprise for SAP integration. That was traditionally what you could do with SharePoint Hybrid. As I said, hybrid team sites and hybrid OneDrive is now also possible. Okay, so what do you need to run on SharePoint hybrid environment? The prerequisites are more or less the same for every scenario that I'm going to talk about today. And the basics, the most important thing is, of course, identity management. If you're embarking on a SharePoint cloud journey, or you're installing or you're configuring Office 365, identity management is always very, very important. If you don't do identity management, you can't use the cloud, you can't use Office 365, and you can't use these hybrid capabilities. So that's really paramount. Now, there are different models in identity management for the cloud. The ones that we use and the ones that we can use for SharePoint Hybrid is the last two options. So directory and password sync and federated identity. In my demos, I'm using directory and password sync. That means I've got an on-premises Active Directory, I've got a SharePoint Online tenant, and I'm synchronizing user data between these two premises. And that's what I'm going to use. If you want to take a step further, you can go to federated identity, in which you install an ADFS server so that your Active Directory user identity becomes the main identity in the whole setup, and you can use things like ADFS and password management. And for some scenarios, like in Exchange, it's also mandatory to use a federated identity. But in most cases, directory and password sync is just sufficient, and that's what I'm going to show you today. All right. So we need the synchronized or federated identities so that your usernames from Active Directory on premises are also available in the cloud. And then we need an internet routable AD domain. That in its own is for some organizations already a problem, but there are some workarounds effectively. Because we're using hybrid, we should secure our SharePoint installation with SSL certificates, so the whole communication channel is secured. Especially if you're working with hybrid search, you will see why that is important. And of course, you can't embark on a cloud journey if you don't use good bandwidth and internet connectivity. If your users are working in the cloud or using hybrid functionalities, a good internet connection is paramount to use this reliably. And for some customers, that is a bit of a problem, but something to be aware of. Most of these hybrid capabilities only work if you're using an Office 365 Enterprise subscription. So that's also something to be aware of. There are some other caveats as far as licensing is concerned that I will talk to you about in a few minutes. And to make this all work, you can use SharePoint Server 2013 or SharePoint 2016, but you still have to use the Enterprise version. Many people use the Enterprise version, but if you're on Standard, and Foundation does not exist anymore in SharePoint 2016, but you have to be on Enterprise. So Enterprise everywhere, on premises, Enterprise CALs in the cloud, otherwise all these things will not work. So as far as identity synchronization is concerned, this is the latest tool that you can use. There are other iterations of the product like DirSync, etc. But I like to use this one. It's Azure AD Connect. It offers a lot of possibilities. It can do multi-domain, multi-forest scenarios, etc., etc. I've included the URL for reference. If you want to download the slides afterwards, you can click on this link to always go to the latest version of Azure AD Connect. So, most organizations use SharePoint Hybrid for its search capabilities. Now, there are some very interesting innovations in the hybrid search area introduced in SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint 2016 recently, but still, when SharePoint 2013 was released, there was already hybrid search capabilities, which we are going to start with today. And the first capability is called a one-way outbound hybrid search. Now, what does that mean? So, in this diagram, on the left-hand side, you see your SharePoint Online tenant, and on the right-hand side, you see your SharePoint on-premises content. Now, what we are doing here is we have two different search engines. We've got a search engine online, and we've got your own SharePoint search engine on-premises. And they both work. They will index your content. On-prem will index on-prem content, and online will index online content. Now, what happens is you can connect those two farms together. So you can connect your SharePoint on-premises farm, in this case, to SharePoint Online, based on a trust relationship. And then you will be able to issue search queries on-premises, and that search query will get sent to SharePoint Online, and you will get a set of results back. That means you can have your on-premises search center, you type a word, you get a result block with SharePoint Online content, and then you get a result block with your normal on-premises content. That's really nice. It's called Query Federation, but it has some caveats that we're also going to discuss in a few minutes. So this is the one-way outbound topology. It's really straightforward. It's not very complicated to configure. So what you need, of course, you need an Active Directory because, well, you need SharePoint, and then you need an Active Directory, and again, an Internet public domain, an Office Enterprise plan, and SharePoint on-premises, like I already told you, and you need a trust, and that is the most important thing, a trust between your on-premises and your SharePoint Online farm. Because if you send a query, a search query to SharePoint Online has to have a way to verify that this request is coming from a trusted source. And through a PowerShell script, a few hundred lines, I guess, you can configure this trust, and it's basically an exchange of certificates. So you create a certificate on premises, you send it to SharePoint Online so that SharePoint Online can use this certificate to know who you are. And at the link below, you can find the hybrid scripts that you need for this. So that's the most important thing. Now, from a SharePoint side, you need a couple of components. So it's not just PowerShell, you have to install some software. First of all, the Microsoft Online Services Sign-In Assistant. That's a software you can download, and also the Azure Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell, because the PowerShell module that you're going to use also uses Windows Active Directory and Azure components. And last but not least, you need the SharePoint Online management shell, which is also a download. So that management shell can be used to connect to SharePoint Online, to create sites, etc., etc. Now, to tie this all together, you need the traditional 3 service applications in your SharePoint on-premises farm. First of all, the user profile service. That seems logical because that's where your users are, or where your user information is configured. The app management service and the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation subscription setting service. I don't know who makes up these all awfully long names, but that's what we have to deal with. So app management service and subscription setting service, you might know these services from configuring apps for your SharePoint 2013 environment. If you're using SharePoint provider hosted apps or SharePoint hosted apps, I shouldn't say add-ins, I know, but I'm still used to saying apps. And those services, you need them too, because they take care of the trust mechanism. And last but not least, and that's very important for some people, is that you need a web application in SharePoint on-premises with Windows authentication and TLM. To be made available. It's all about security trimming, right? You don't want to have your SharePoint Online content return results that you're not entitled to see. So there has to be some security trimming. That's why we need identity federation, but that's also why we need a web application with Windows authentication in NTLM. Now, if you're not using this, if you're using something else like, I don't know, ADFS or forms-based authentication, that's no problem. It can be a dedicated zone which extends the default one. So just extend your web application to a separate website which uses Windows authentication with NTLM, and that will work. Now, how do you configure this one-way outbound search? First of all, you have to log into your on-premises farm as a farm administrator and a search administrator. And then you have to create a result source in SharePoint 2013. I'll show you later on in a demo how that works. So you tell SharePoint, okay, if you issue a search query, you can also send this search query to your SharePoint Online tenant. You give it a remote service URL and you say that it's a SharePoint installation, and then you say that you have to pass your credentials. That's all pretty straightforward. This makes the connection from your search service online to make SharePoint Online aware. Second is that you have to configure a query rule on SharePoint 2013. And that means that as long as when you issue a search query in your search center on premises, SharePoint would automatically rerun this query for SharePoint Online. And that's why you need a query rule. Now, if you all configure this, and this is just an example of how that looks, you can search for something. In this case, I'm searching for SharePoint Inspired. And first of all, the first 2 results are my results from SharePoint Online. And the second and the other results beneath, they are the results from SharePoint on-premises. It works. It's pretty straightforward. It's, of course, if you're using a proxy to connect to the internet, it might you might need some additional tweaking or something, but it's not that hard. It's also one way, so that's no problem. And so if you issue a search query, in this case SharePoint Inspired, it searches its local index and it gets the results underneath, and it's also sending this query to SharePoint Online, and it's returning these 2 results. You see that it is displayed in a separate result block. This has some repercussions that we are going to talk about later on, and that's also why Microsoft decided to come up with a new hybrid topology and new hybrid functionality, because this separate result block was not really, well, it was okay, it was just okay, but it was not really, you could not do very fancy stuff with it. And I'm going to show you how that works later on. Another thing is just the other scenario. It's called one-way inbound hybrid search. And that's just the other way around. So you still have your SharePoint Online tenant, you still have your SharePoint on-premises installation, but we're doing it the other way around. So that means we still have 2 search engines, one online and one on-premises. But this time we are issuing a search query on the left-hand side, in the Microsoft Data Center in your SharePoint Online tenant, and we're trying to get results from SharePoint on-premises. But as you can imagine, that is a bit more complicated because, well, how does SharePoint Online connect to your SharePoint on-premises farm to get this data? And that's why you need a reverse proxy in this scenario. You also need a reverse proxy if you want to do Office Web Apps previews, for example, but you also need one for the one-way inbound topology. Now, I'm going to show you which reverse proxy servers are supported in just a few slides, but it's basically the same. It's still query federation, only from SharePoint Online to SharePoint on-premises, so the other way around. You implement a reverse proxy server so that SharePoint Online has an endpoint to connect to your SharePoint on-prem, and then you get the same result, also two separate result blocks, as I've shown you in the screenshot. So the requirements are exactly the same. You still have to do all this PowerShell stuff and everything, and then you also need a reverse proxy server and an SSL certificate. And of course, that SSL certificate has to be trusted by a public or trusted certificate authority, otherwise SharePoint Online will have a problem with it. Another thing you have to do is you have to configure the secure store service application in SharePoint Online, something we didn't have to do for the first scenario, but that's what we have to do in Online. I've included a link for your reference on how to configure this and with all the nitty-gritty details that you need. All right, so which reverse proxy servers are supported? First of all, the basic one, Windows Server 2012 R2 Web Application Proxy, which is included into the product. It has some interesting capabilities, but they're basic. But it's enough to make this inbound hybrid search work. You can also use TMG, which is deprecated, we know, but it can be made to work. It's supported for this scenario. And then the usual suspects like F5 and Citrix NetScaler. For a definite list, you can go to this URL to see what exactly you have to configure and what do you have to do for each reverse proxy server. To make this work, again, you have to log on to SharePoint administration, central administration, but not the on-premises one, but the SharePoint Online one. And then also, again, you configure a result source on SharePoint Online, more or less with the same capabilities, with the same configuration, and instead that you don't provide your SharePoint Online tenant URL, but you provide the endpoint of your SharePoint on-premises farm that you are exposing through your reverse proxy. Again, you have to create a query rule on SharePoint Online, to make sure that if you issue a query, that this query also gets sent to SharePoint on-premises and that the results get returned. And finally, we've got the two-way inbound-outbound scenario, and that is just the same as the two first scenarios, but combined. So you can issue a search query in SharePoint Online, and you can also issue a search query in SharePoint on-premises. You configure a reverse proxy server to make everything work, and it's a fairly straightforward and seamless experience. I think if you would want to configure this and you've got your SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint Online tenant already configured and you've got identity management already configured, it will probably, especially for the outbound scenario, take you, I don't know, 20 minutes or so to configure this. The inbound scenario, because of the reverse proxy server, is a little bit more complicated, but it works equally well. The nice thing about these two scenarios is that they're already supported and they're already in the product. So if you're using SharePoint 2013, it even might be the RTM version. You should not be on the RTM version, but even on the first version of SharePoint 2013, this was supported, and this can be made to work. So, but if you want to be really fancy, you have to go to the new hybrid capabilities that we're going to talk about. Because what is the problem with this existing query federation scenario? You might say it's complex to set up. You have to install PowerShell, use PowerShell, exchange certificates. That's for some people already very hard. And it requires a complete search service application. For example, if you're configuring the inbound hybrid search and you're issuing all your search queries in SharePoint Online, well, why do you still need a SharePoint on-premises search center, etc., etc.? So you need two different search service applications. The separate result blocks, for some people that's a problem because it's in a separate result block, you also don't have ranking and relevance integration. So the two result sets are considered to be completely separate, and you can't do really interesting things from a relevance and ranking perspective. You also have no refiners for this result block. So on the left-hand side, for people that don't see SharePoint every day, on the left-hand side we have refiners, which you can use to drill down into the search results. And that will work, but only for the on-premises installations. So it was a bit cumbersome. It worked, it was nice, it was already something, but now there is something new, a new kid on the block. And it's called the Cloud Search Service Application. be aware it's still in preview. So everything I've already talked about is released and can be used and is supported, but the Cloud Search Service application is still in preview. So also that has some repercussions like pricing that is not known yet. So this is a completely different picture. What it will do is you will have still your SharePoint on-premises search service application that you have to provision, but only for crawling and content processing. That means that your index and your query component, they are in the cloud. So that's really important. And that means that you have a unified search index. You don't have a search index on premises and online anymore. No, you only have a search index online. That means that you crawl on premises and all the index data gets sent over the internet, that's also important, to your SharePoint Online tenant. And because it's a unified index, all the new innovations like Delve and everything will just work. And you will have no separate result blocks anymore because they're all coming from the same data source. It's all in the same index. It supports all the traditional content sources, so it supports SharePoint, but it also supports things like file shares. You can index your on-premises file shares if you've got millions and millions of them and don't care about the size of the index anymore on premises and how much storage you have to provision, and you don't have to accommodate for all this growth. You can just send those index results to SharePoint Online and store them there. That's a really compelling scenario, for example, for archival situations. Now, if you have one unified search index, another thing that is very important is security trimming. You know, in SharePoint, we by default have security trimming, so you're never supposed to see anything that you don't have access to. And in the search engine, that is the same, and also in this new hybrid search capability. Security trimming works because it's in SharePoint Online or in Office 365 or in Azure AD, we have a new user property that stores the on-premises SID, and that is then used to do security trimming in this unified index. So you will never see search results that you're not entitled to see. Because your search index is in the cloud, I've talked about capacity planning perspective, but you can also take advantage of all the other Azure AD and Office 365 security, compliance, and data protection measures that are there. And believe me, you can't secure your data center as secure as Microsoft can in their online infrastructure. And one of the nice things is that you get Delve, and I will show you how that works. So you can use Delve with your on-premises content, and that's a really compelling scenario. Okay, but how does this crawling works? I've already told you that we still have a crawling and content processing component on premises, but how does that work? How does it send the data to the cloud? So first of all, you do your normal crawl in SharePoint on premises. You crawl your SharePoint content on your file shares. So that has not changed. And then it gets uploaded to Azure Blob Storage. So it doesn't go directly to SharePoint Online. It's stored in an, let's say, intermediate location in Azure Blob Storage. Why? Because that has a few advantages. For example, that Azure Blob Storage has much less stringent throttling mechanisms. If you would send your on-premises index to the cloud all the time, and you will do a few full crawls a day, or a few incremental crawls probably, that would interfere with SharePoint Online throttling mechanisms. And if you're using Azure Blob Storage, there are other things in place to make it work a little bit faster. Then once your index files are in Azure, they get analyzed because there is some consistency checking, and of course it has to make sure that it's in the right tenant, etc. So all this black box processing, let's say, and then in the end your online index is fed into your SharePoint Online farm, where it can be used to retrieve search results. So you crawl online, you send all your index files not to the local index component, you send it to the cloud. You send it to Azure, it gets analyzed and processed, and then it's fed into SharePoint Online. That's how it works. Now, if you want to get this capability, you can already have SharePoint 2013 do this, but you have to be on the August 2015 cumulative update or higher. So if you're still running, I don't know, RTM or Service Pack 1 or a CU prior to August 2015, it will not work. Or you can use SharePoint 2016. The slide says beta 2 or higher. We know we have a release candidate, and we have RTM and the evaluation version that just came out last week. So if you're already using SharePoint 2016 from beta 2 or higher builds, that can be made to work, and of course also in the RTM version. Now, from a SharePoint prerequisite standpoint, you have to install less stuff than with the traditional hybrid inbound and outbound federation. You have to install Microsoft Online Services Sign-in Assistant, and you typically install that on the server that is using your search components, running your search components, and then also Azure PowerShell commandlets. And again, these are the links to download the right version. Next, there is a very interesting page by some Microsoft field engineers and Microsoft engineers, which state exactly what you have to do. You can download the PowerShell script that I'm going to use or that I'm going to show you in a few seconds, and you can find all the necessary resources there. So the scripts that I will show you and a few other configuration tips and tricks. So now, how do we configure this? First of all, you have to create a new search service application on premises. If you already have one, you can't change the existing search service application to make it work with your hybrid features. That's not possible, unfortunately. I don't know if they might introduce these features to later on, but I don't think so. So you really have to have a new search service application. Creating one is pretty straightforward with PowerShell. It's just a traditional way of doing it, apart from the fact that you have to include a new parameter, and that's cloud index. Cloud index equals true. And that's the only thing that you have to change in your existing setup scripts. You don't have to change anything else but this. So in your new SP Enterprise Search Service Application commandlet, include cloud index equals true, and that cloud index parameter was first included in SharePoint 2013 and in the August 2015 CU, and that's why you need these cumulative updates to make this parameter work. And that's all there is to it from a search service application perspective. Second of all, you have to run the onboarding script. It's a nice script. It's a few hundred lines, I guess. And it's also pretty straightforward to run. You have to specify your SharePoint Online tenant URL, and you have to specify an account which has the necessary rights in your SharePoint Online tenant, and that's basically it. Now, you have to be very careful. When you run the script, do it in a test environment first, in a good test environment, because if you're using stuff like provider-hosted apps, it might break your provider-hosted apps, because in this script, they are setting the SharePoint authentication realm to the same one as in SharePoint Online, as your SharePoint Online tenant. And if you've configured provider-hosted apps previously, you have to be very careful, because that might break some of these capabilities. Now, we're currently working with Microsoft to get this fixed and to be a little bit more, let's say, conservative for this script, not to just replace everything, but for a test environment. And if you analyze the script, you can also probably change it if you want. That can be made to work, but be very, very careful if you run it on your environment if you're already running provider-hosted apps. So you launch the script, and after a few seconds, well, the trust between your SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online farm is configured, and that's what this script does. The next thing is just start a crawl. Like you are used to, go to your search application in on-premises, start your crawl. I've only one content source here, but it's also very simple. Start a full crawl, and then the indexing process will start. So the crawl will start, and it feeds all these documents to SharePoint Online. Next of all, and that's the thing I always forget, is you have to configure a default result source. Because by default, by design, if you go to an on-premises search center and you issue a search query, SharePoint will use a result source, the local SharePoint system result source, if I'm not mistaken, and that searches the on-premises index. But the on-premises index, it's still there, but it's empty, so you will not get any results. So that's why you have to create in your search service application a separate result source, and I'll show you how that's configured. So you give it a name, you specify that it's remote SharePoint, and you just give it the URL of your SharePoint Online tenant, and that's it. And afterwards, and the next step is even more important, because that's a step that I even forget more, is that you have to set it as default. So in this case, in this screenshot, I've created a SharePoint Online result source, and I have to set it as default. And that means that all search queries in my farm are going through this SharePoint Online result source and get sent to the unified index that we have running in the cloud. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And next step is you can test basic querying. That means you can go on the left-hand side, for example, to your SharePoint on-premises installation, and on the left-hand side we've got a SharePoint 2013 farm. You can issue a query, and then you will have search results. And the fact that you have any search result means that your hybrid setup works, because we don't have an index locally anymore. Because if you've got a result, it's a result coming from SharePoint Online. So you can issue a search query. In this example, I'm using a star, and on the right-hand side, you can do the same thing in SharePoint Online. So you issue a search query, and you will get results for SharePoint Online and also for your SharePoint on-premises farm. That's all there is to it. Okay, so let me quickly show you how to set up. Now, I must say I will not do the complete setup again, because I know that I will probably break something, and that's not what we want in a live demonstration. So I'll show you the scripts that I use to configure this. Now, this is my SharePoint on-premises service application setup script, and this is the PowerShell that I used. And you can see that it's just a normal PowerShell command, and I issued the parameter cloud index equals to true. And that's all there is to it. You let it run, you configure your topology as you would always do. Now, be aware, it's not because we're using hybrid search that we don't use a local index component and query processing component anymore. The only thing they've changed to the search service application is the cloud index parameter, but all the rest is still there. It's not a special version of SharePoint search that they've created, so you still have to have all these components ready in your search topology before your search topology will work. And afterwards, if you go to the central administration, you will see that there is no way to verify if this search service application is a cloud search service application. You can't see it in central administration. You can only see it in PowerShell. If you go to your search service application topology, you will see all these green check marks here, and you will even have a check mark for your index partition and your query processing component, which are still running. There is still a node runner process attached to it, but it's not doing anything. It's not getting involved in the search crawling. So that's what you get. When we go to our farm, to our PowerShell, sorry, we can get a reference to our search service application, and we can look at the components, and we can again see here that we have stuff like query processing component and index component, but they're, like I said, they're not used. The only way to verify if your search service application is cloud ready or is using hybrid search is these two parameters. Of course, the cloud index that we specified ourselves, which will be true, or there's a special property is hybrid, and if you run it, it will also equal 1. I don't know why there are two, and I don't know why they are, what the difference is between them, but that's the only way, as far as I'm concerned, to see if your search service application is hybrid aware. So if you created your search center or your search service application, the next thing you do is run this onboarding script that you can get from a Microsoft site. It's a fairly lengthy script. It's a few hundred lines, but in the end, you will get a trust between your SharePoint on-prem and your SharePoint online farm. If you go to your central administration, you can verify a few things. You can go to Manage Service Applications, and then you will see that this script has created additional service application proxies, like this one, ACS proxy, SPO App Management proxy. These things are created by this script, and they configure the trust. You can also go to Security, and then Manage Trust, and see that we have two new certificates, also created by this PowerShell script that we just run, and these are the certificates that create the trust between SharePoint on-premises and your Azure tenant that is behind, and your SharePoint Online tenant. So that's something visible in the search service application. Now, if you want to do a crawl, you can just go to your search service application, start a full crawl, and well, it will begin working. Now, there are, if you want to troubleshoot, and we'll come back to troubleshoot a little bit later, there are some parameters that you can set to get more information about your crawling and your feeding to Azure. And that's included here in SharePoint Foundation Search, and there is a category crawler Azure plugin. And if you set it to verbose, you can see what exactly gets sent to Azure. And if there is a problem with your Azure connection, that will display in your ULS log. So just filter on category contains Azure, for example, and you will get lots of interesting information. Okay, so if we've configured the search service application, let's switch over to our client system. This is my client running Windows 10. Now, what you see here is my SharePoint Online tenant, and I've got a theme site here with document library, and I've got a document, and when I click on my document, I've got hello from the cloud, so that works. And then I've got a SharePoint 2016 installation, but it can be made to work with SharePoint 2013 in the exact same way. This is SharePoint 2016, which you can see on the black heading. So the blue one is online and the black one is on premises. And I've got another document here. And when you open it, it says hello from SharePoint 2016 on premises. So those are the two documents that I've available. So one in the cloud and one in my SharePoint Online tenant. Now, this is my SharePoint Online Search Center, and I can issue search query, in this case everything, but I can search for hello, for example, and then I'll get all my different results. So the first result is for SharePoint Online, thvo.sharepoint.com, that's online, but the other one, this one, hello from on-premises, and I've got, that's from a SharePoint 2013 installation that I've already also configured for hybrid search. And then we've got a hello from SharePoint 2016 on-premises. So you see these, you see it's through the URL. This is a SharePoint on-premises content, and this is SharePoint Online content. That's really nice. If you go to, for example, Delve, you can also surface these documents in Delve. Now, what does not work already is all the signals. So if you go to your Delve, you will not automatically see all your on-premises content because they still have to, well, include that into the product. So also on your About Me page, you will see your cloud documents, but you will not see your on-premises documents yet. But you can already search for them if you want. So if you go to search and you search for something, in this case, hello, in Delve, you will see your cloud content, and you will also see your on-premises content from my SharePoint 2013 and from my SharePoint 2016 farm. And if you click on that document, you also can open the document if your SharePoint 2016 farm is reachable. And we talk about that later on. So that's SharePoint Online. That all nicely works. Now let's go to our SharePoint on-premises search center. So this is my SharePoint on-premises farm, SF02 search, etc., on-premises, and I issue a search query and I get nothing. That's why, because we didn't configure the result source yet. So it's searching its local index, which is empty. To configure that, we are going to our SharePoint server, to the SharePoint server. We go to our search service application, and I've cheated a little bit, and that I already created my result source. So this is the result source for SharePoint Online. It is a remote SharePoint installation with this URL, and that is the URL of my SharePoint Online tenant. And I just sent all the search terms over to that SharePoint Online tenant. You could filter something if you want to. And after you created this, you have to set it as default. So you right click, you say set as default. So all search queries are going to this SharePoint Online result source. And we then go back to our client, and I have to run it on a client because my user that has administrative rights in SharePoint does not have access. And then after a few refreshes probably, because it takes some time, it's still SharePoint, it has to apply all these settings, you will see that I will get SharePoint, I will get search results in my on-premises farm. You see it's a black border, so it's on-premises. And I get results from SharePoint Online here and from SharePoint on-premises like here. So that works. So that's the basic capability. So you create your search service application, you create a trust, you configure your search service application with the result source, and then on both sides you can issue search queries, and that will work. Okay, let's quickly go back to the slides. Right. So that was basic functionality. All right. Now, to make things a little bit more interesting, there are additional capabilities. Like there is a new managed property, and this property is called isExternalContent. And based on this managed property, you can do some very interesting things like run certain display templates. Be aware, isExternal means external from SharePoint Online. So if you use this query on premises or online, you will always get the on-premises content. So if you use isExternalContent equals 1 or true, then you will only get your SharePoint Online search results returned. And that can be very handy to make, for example, a new search vertical. So that you have a search vertical for your on-premises content, for example. Okay, some tips and tricks how to perform an index reset. Normally you should not be really doing that, but anyway, if you want, you can't do an index reset like you're used to in SharePoint on premises, because that will not trickle down to your SharePoint Online index, and you probably don't want to reset your SharePoint Online index either. Or maybe you want, but that's not possible. So you have to clear your content source, perform a full crawl, and then your index, at least the on-premises content, will be emptied. There is a known bug, so if you're using the October, November, or December 2015 cumulative update, query federation does not work. That means that searching on premises for online content will not work. So that's important. So you have to apply the January 2016 CU for SharePoint 2013 or later, or of course use SharePoint 2016, which has all these capabilities already built in. I've already showed you this. So this is the logging category that you can use to get more information if your crawl does not work. That's something you can use. If your queries don't work, if they don't work in SharePoint Online, you have to check your crawl logs, and because they still work, so the traditional SharePoint on-premises crawl logs, they still work. They still contain entries because crawl and content processing is already is working. And if you have no results in SharePoint on-premises, check first of all the logged-in user. Why is that important? Because of security trimming. And you have to be aware of the fact that every user that is going to use your SharePoint search engine has to have a license, an enterprise license in Office 365. So that's important, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. And then, of course, you have to check the default result source, the thing that I always forget and I just shown you, so that all the queries go to the right index and not to the local index, which is empty. So all the local search components are still there. They're still needed, otherwise you can't activate your topology. But you have to be aware of the fact that it's important for your capacity planning that you don't have to take into account query processing and index partitions anymore. So you can just run all the search components or most of the search components on two separate servers, for example, and also run the index and query processing component on that server, something that you probably would not do right now, but because they're not really used, those processes won't take up much performance. So that's safe to do. In my example here, I have only one server, so everything is running on the same farm, same server, but in the real world, you would probably have two servers. So you don't need 4 servers anymore for a complete redundant setup. So some additional considerations, just that you know, you can connect multiple farms to the same tenant. You've seen that in my example. I've already have a SharePoint 2013 and a SharePoint 2016 on-premises farm connected to the same tenant. So that's important. That's possible. It offers a lot of opportunities for worldwide implementations. For example, you can have different on-premises farms in your different countries connected to your same corporate online tenant. Every user needs an Office 365 license. If you're using the cloud right now with just a pilot group of 100 users, but your effective user base is 10,000 users, well, you have to take into account that if they want to use SharePoint Search or Hybrid Search, that they need a license too, otherwise security trimming does not work. Something else is that advanced customizations are not possible. Things like, let's say, content enrichment, things that you programmed, they are not possible. So if you have a very seriously customized search service application, be very careful. Not everything that you've configured might work. And like I said, Delve is also not 100% implemented yet, because it's preview. And the same goes for costing. So it will probably cost something to put your index in the cloud. Now they have capped this and throttled this to a few gigabytes, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But of course, if you want to send everything over to SharePoint Online, this can be a cost factor which is not clear yet. So they have not announced the pricing and also not the throttling mechanisms yet. If you want to have document previews for your on-premises content in SharePoint Online, you still need a reverse proxy server and, of course, an Office Web App Server. But if you click on your SharePoint Online search result and it's a SharePoint on-premises search result, then you still need an on-premises Office Web App Server through a reverse proxy to make this work, because SharePoint is not going to send this document to the cloud and do Office Web Apps preview there. So then you still need additional stuff. Something to be aware of, people search. A bit of the same problem as the default result source that we already talked about, because by default it will send the queries for your people search results to the local index, and that will not work. So you have to make a decision here. Am I going to use the on-premises people directory, or am I going to use the SharePoint Online one? And these are the two queries that you can configure to make this work. In my example, I'm using the second one, SharePoint Online. So I'm using my SharePoint Online as people source, and then I'm specifying, okay, give me all people where they're not coming from on-premise. That's basically what this second query says. And also on premises, if you go for the second method, you will see that you will get SharePoint people results, but that the pictures, their user pictures, won't render. And that's because of cross-site scripting protection mechanisms in SharePoint 2016 and 2013. So your search results get returned on the search page, but the profile pictures are linked directly from SharePoint Online, and SharePoint will not automatically do that. So to make that work, you have to run, so you have to change one property on your web application called cross-domain photos enabled and set it to true, and then it will work. If you've ever used ADFS, then you probably know this phenomenon, because that's more or less the same. Okay, so let me show you how people search can be made to work. Let's go to our client first. This is my SharePoint Online tenant. I can search for everyone, and I get people returned with a picture. Now I have only one picture for this particular user. But in SharePoint on premises, if you do the same thing, you will not get any results, again, because of local index. Now, what I've did is I created a result source, like we did for the normal search results, but I've created one especially for people results, in which I specified that I would only have on-premises or online users. Now, making this result source, that's not the only thing you have to do. You also have to configure or reconfigure this page to make use of this result source. So you can edit your page of your people results. You can go to your people search results, core results web part. You can edit it, and you can change the query. And instead of choosing local people results system, you go for the one I created, in this case, SharePoint Online people, which will send the query to SharePoint Online. And then next, your way through the page, or check in and publish. And with a little bit of luck, and after probably a few refreshes, we will get people results from on-premises from online. Okay. Now, this was the second problem I told you about. We don't see the profile pictures because this is running in sf02search.thvo.net. That's on-prem. If you go to this picture, you will see that it's directly coming from SharePoint Online. So to change that, you have to run this piece of PowerShell. This one, very straightforward. You get a reference to your web application. You set the cross-domain photos enabled to true. And with a little bit of luck, that should be working now. Let's go back to our client, and you see I've got profile pictures for everyone now, so that works. Okay, so that's people search. Another thing that you can do is play with this is external content property, managed property. Because if your users are using SharePoint Online and they are searching for on-premises content, by default, if they're not connected to a VPN or direct access or are physically on the corporate network, they will not be able to see automatically which documents are on premises and which documents are online. And together with Elio Struijf, someone else in the SharePoint community in Belgium, I've created a display template especially for that. So it's free, it's on GitHub, you can download it through this URL, and what it will do, it will configure, or you can configure a display template for all your external content, so for all your on-premises content. So if you search for something, you can just click on your cloud result, but if you want to go to your SharePoint on-premises search result, you will see that there will be an icon to notify you, okay, you have to have an on-premises connection or a VPN active to be able to download this document or to open this document. So if your users are not corporate connected, then they still get a warning that this particular link will probably not work. Right. Last but not least, so that was everything about hybrid search. A quick introduction about hybrid OneDrive and team sites. What it all boils down to is that your OneDrive can be redirected to the cloud. That means if you're clicking on your My Site or your OneDrive in SharePoint 2013 or 2016, that you can automatically get redirected to your online OneDrive. Now, this can be made to work to audiences. So if you configure an audience for people who are allowed to do hybrids, then you can redirect only those users to the cloud and have the other users use the traditional OneDrive sites on premises. So you can mix and match if you want. And hybrid team sites, that basically means that you can follow sites on premises and that they appear in SharePoint Online in Office 365 in your sites page. So to make this work, there are some hybrid configuration wizards. This is a screenshot from SharePoint Online, and for each of these capabilities, you've got a wizard that you can run. So you can go to SharePoint Online Administration Center, then to SharePoint Administration, and then you can run these wizards. It's fairly straightforward. Of course, you have to be logged in on your SharePoint box with the right user and go to this page, and then you follow your way through a wizard. It's a click once application that automatically configures the trust between your SharePoint Online farm and your SharePoint on-premises farm. And afterwards, in SharePoint Central Administration, you have to say, okay, I want to redirect for these users my OneDrive or my team sites. That's just next finish, basically. So afterwards, if you've configured this trust through the Click Once application, you have to do an iris reset, otherwise it won't work. And then you have to configure these redirection options in your on-premises farm. And that's the on-premises configuration that we're talking about. In SharePoint Central Administration, you've got a link to OneDrive and to Yammer, to Office 365 and Yammer, and there on the bottom of the page, you can configure the link to your SharePoint Online OneDrive. And then you can choose which users get redirected, everyone or specific users. By default, it's set to OneDrive and sites redirection for everyone, so be careful. Okay, you need more or less the same prerequisites as for all the rest of the hybrid stuff. So with one additional service application, and that's the search service application. It's needed for this capability. Okay, and to end, let me show you how that works. So this is my SharePoint server. And when we go to Central Administration, on the left-hand side, you've got an Office 365 header, and then you can configure Yammer if you want that. This is a capability that will be introduced in a few months, hopefully. But this is the option we are looking for: configure hybrid OneDrive and sites feature. So I've already run these hybrid configuration wizards because it takes some time. I've specified my SharePoint Online OneDrive. It still says my site here, but it's OneDrive. And I've even configured an audience. And I've got an Active Directory group called Hybrid Users, which are allowed to have OneDrive and sites redirection. Now, the user that I'm logged in with is not part of this group, this SP admin user. So I can show you what happens if you're not in the audience. You can click on OneDrive, and you will go to your on-premises OneDrive. Notice the black box. If you are logged in with a user that is a member of this group, for example, well, doesn't really matter. I'm logged in here. I can go to SharePoint. I can go to OneDrive on premises, and then I get redirected automatically to OneDrive in the cloud. So that's hybrid OneDrive. The hybrid sites feature, it's also very nice. So let's go to SharePoint on premises, and let's say I'm really interested in search, and I want to, no, let's take another one. Come on, my team site. This is my team site. It's a very interesting site. I want to follow it. I've got a follow button on the right-hand side. Follow this site and get back to it easily. If you click that, now following this site, and you go to SharePoint Online, and you notice the waffle here, the application picker, and you go to SharePoint Online, and you go to Sites. You will see that you will have your on-premises sites that you followed here in your SharePoint Online sites directory. So that works really, really nice. You can you can pin it to the top. You can stop following, etc., etc. So hybrid team sites is basically pinning sites here in this site directory. So if you're working in SharePoint Online or Office 365, you can also have build, let's say, a directory to your SharePoint on-premises sites just by going to the sites icon here. All right, so that includes the session. A few key takeaways. Hybrid is the future. It's not because, SharePoint on-premise is still okay, but hybrid is probably and is definitely the future. So all the new innovations are in the cloud. If you want to take advantage of them, hybrid, definitely look at hybrid. If you want to make this all work, identity management is key. You can start experimenting with hybrid search already today with SharePoint 2016, but also on SharePoint 2013 if you've got the right version. And don't forget, and for many organizations that's a little bit of a showstopper, but still it has to work. Make sure that you license everyone in your organization if they want to use SharePoint search, because you can't say this search service application sends index files to the cloud and then let everyone use it without having a SharePoint Online identity. You really, really need this, otherwise security trimming doesn't work. All right, I think we're going to open the chat if there are still additional questions. If you want, you can reach out to me afterwards through email or through Twitter or through another channel that you prefer, and I'll be happy to answer your questions, and I'll thank you for your attention. Thank you.